Remember the Mobiuz EX240? It was arguably the best monitor of its class, but unfortunately BenQ decided to replace it with the EX240S, which wasn't quite as good as the original, but maintained the somewhat high price. But no, there's this. The EX240, which looks pretty similar at first glance, but is a much more affordable monitor despite having similar specs. Well, this time around BenQ went with a 23.8-inch panel by LG Display. The 25 series monitors use 24.5-inch panels made by AUO. But that's about it for the specs difference. This still is a 1080p IPS panel with a refresh rate of 165Hz. The size difference isn't really something you're gonna notice, so the EX240 closely competes with the EX2510S, which seems like a weird business decision by BenQ, as the EX2510S still is available and a good bit more expensive. At the time of making this video, the EX240 goes for roughly $160 US, while the EX2510S costs almost 50% more. I have international links in the video description if you want to check the current pricing in your region. So with such a price difference, the 25-inch version might be a bit obsolete if this one can keep up performance-wise. The build quality is really promising already. I quite like that the EX240, despite being super affordable, doesn't feel cheap. The quality of the black plastic and the overall build quality definitely is above average for this price class, and very similar to the EX2510 and 2510S. I also think that it looks a bit more premium than something like the AOC 24G2 SP, but I'm still not a big fan of these orange accents on the stand. And BenQ adopted the typical V-shaped stand-based design that many monitors use, but this isn't the greatest design in the world, as it takes up more space on the desk than a flat base or the base design that BenQ is using for the 25 series. A feature that's kinda unheard of in this price class is the light sensor. Now, I would love to see this working just as good as those light sensors that can be found on a smartphone. Unfortunately though, the brightness adjustments are slow and somewhat choppy. Really no comparison to a smartphone. And to top it all off, activating the light sensor grays out a bunch of settings in the OSD, including the color temperature adjustment. So I guess most people will prefer adjusting the brightness manually. Speaking of brightness, the max brightness tops out at roughly 400 nits, which is exceptionally high for a monitor of this price class. Just make sure to set the peak brightness setting to max in the monitor's OSD. Either way, the lowest setting is about 50 nits, which is also a pretty good result. Now, the contrast ratio is really nothing to write home about. 1000 to 1 is about what you would expect from an IPS panel. If anything, the contrast is slightly worse now than that of the EX2510S, which reached about 1200 to 1. This is really not a crazy difference though. And either way, the contrast is high enough for competitive gaming, productivity, watching videos and all that kind of stuff. But the contrast is not good enough to really enjoy watching movies in the dark or playing super cinematic games, let alone watching good HDR content. But yes, the EX240 supports HDR, but it's not a great HDR experience, which doesn't really come by surprise given that this is a sub $200 monitor that simply lacks the hardware capabilities for good HDR. BenQ didn't do a terrible job when it comes to the HDR accuracy though, but the contrast ratio, the max brightness and the color gamut volume are very limited. So yeah, in short, don't buy this monitor for HDR or you're gonna be disappointed. But what about SDR? The original Mobiuz EX2510 was exceptionally color accurate out of the box, so it was a great pick for people who like to do photo editing as a hobby or just like an accurate image. The EX240 though is not off to a good start. This is the performance of the standard picture profile and not one of those weird gaming presets, so I'd expect it to be a bit more color accurate. But at least the sRGB mode looks better. Still, the white point is a bit off, so I wouldn't want to use this mode for color accurate tasks without making adjustments. Unfortunately though, the RGB sliders are locked in this mode, so we actually cannot make any adjustments to the white point. That's really unfortunate because otherwise the sRGB mode would have been great. We can make adjustments to the standard mode though. This mode gives us the full color gamut volume, which is only about 14% larger than sRGB anyways, so we don't really get crazy high oversaturation in this mode either. And after making some adjustments, the results are actually pretty decent. I'm not sure though why BenQ don't give us the more accurate gamma curve of the sRGB mode in the standard mode as well, but the gamma is actually not as bad as it looks on the graph, as our eyes aren't very sensitive to gamma deviations in that range anyway. Of course, calibrating and profiling gives us a nearly perfect gamma curve and color accuracy. In case you don't have a colorimeter, I'd suggest using these settings. I'd also recommend applying the ICC profile that I made for this monitor. It's made to be used in conjunction with these settings. Download link in the video description. Now before we continue, I want to thank Grovemade who sponsored this portion of the video. They've sent me a few of the desk accessories to make my setup look a bit nicer. Like this desk tray, which holds all the items that otherwise would be floating around on the desk. Like a pair of IMs or another mouse that I'm currently testing. Putting your stuff on a tray just makes everything look way less cluttered. The inside of the tray is actually made from cork that was hand-dyed with Japanese calligraphy ink, which looks pretty nice, I think. The design also goes well with their other accessories, like these headphone stands made from tanned leather and wood, or this wrist rest for low-profile keyboards. Check out the description for links and a 10% discount code. Back to the video. Now let's take a look at the response times, motion blur, and all the other gaming-related stuff. The previous Mobiuz branded monitors that I've tested had pretty good overdrive tuning, and fortunately the EX240 is no different. We get 4 different overdrive modes to choose from. The highest overdrive setting, which is AMA3, clearly shows inverse ghosting, so you should really avoid this mode. All the other modes though, essentially are viable at 165 Hz, but AMA1 shows the best results. AMA2 is usable as well if you're not very sensitive to inverse ghosting. But as the response time measurements confirm, AMA1 overall is the more balanced overdrive mode. A 1 millisecond slower response time average is a worthy trade-off for getting the better overshoot performance. Generally speaking, this is a pretty good result for an IPS panel and about the same response times performance that you're getting from the more expensive EX2510S. Unfortunately, AMA1 is also an overdrive mode that works great with lower refresh rates. It's the best overdrive mode down to at least 120 Hz and is still usable at 60 Hz. I'd consider this a single overdrive mode experience. But if you're using refresh rates between 60 and up to about 100 Hz a lot, you still might want to switch to AMA0. Now how does the EX240 stack up against other monitors? The comparison to its 25-inch counterpart really shows that there isn't much of a difference between them. On close inspection, the EX240 has ever so slightly more ghosting in the dark track, but that's such a minor difference that you're really not gonna notice in-game. The other tracks look basically identical, so BenQ again did a pretty good job with the tuning here. It's really about as fast as a 165 Hz IPS panel can get. In comparison, the AOC24G2 SPU, which is using a 165 Hz IPS panel as well, shows a bit more smearing on the trailing edge, so the EX240 is the faster monitor. Now BenQ also implemented backlight strobing, which they call blur reduction, on their Mobiuz branded monitors. But to be honest, I really wonder why they even bothered when this is what it looks like. The 25-inch models actually have kinda decent backlight strobing modes, so this clearly is a step back. And the comparison to some of the best strobing modes really shows how bad this implementation actually is. So blur reduction is a feature you should avoid on the EX240. Adaptive sync though is worthwhile turning on. NVIDIA users have to manually enable G-Sync in the NVIDIA control panel, as the EX240 is not certified by NVIDIA as G-Sync compatible. Despite that, the adaptive sync performance is totally flawless. No flickering or any other defects. And in case you're wondering, turning on adaptive sync also doesn't increase the display lag. Either way, we're getting 3.2 milliseconds of lag, which is pretty quick for a 165 Hz monitor. Now, is the EX240 worth buying, or should you rather get something else? Maybe even spend a bit more to get the EX2510S instead? Well, paying more for the EX2510S really doesn't make much sense. Both are equally as fast and equally great monitors for gaming. The quality of their backlight strobing modes really is the biggest difference between them. But the strobing implementation of the EX2510S is still not great. It's way better than on the EX240, but not something that could justify the much higher price tag. Most people probably ain't gonna be using the backlight strobing on the EX2510S anyway. And when it comes to image quality, the cheaper EX240 actually has the slight edge. It gets a good bit brighter in SDR mode, has the slightly larger color gamut volume, and also is a bit more color accurate. So the EX2510S really doesn't make any sense anymore, especially not with the price difference being as big as it is right now. Not sure if BenQ are gonna lower the price of the EX2510S in the future, so I definitely have both monitors linked down below. Now, I've previously been recommending the Gigabyte G24F a lot, and the EX240 delivers a performance very similar to the G24F. And as the G24F recently got replaced by the G24F2, which I haven't tested yet, and which makes the original G24F really hard to get your hands on, the EX240 actually is my new #1 recommendation for this class. Thanks for watching, bis zum nächsten Video.